Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, time is now 10:30 and I shall resume the inquiry into the appeal made by Bargate Homes and Vivid Homes against the decision of Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council to refuse outline permission with all matters reserved except for access for 75 dwellings, open space, allotments, landscaping and access via Sheepfair Lane. This is the fourth day of the inquiry. First of all, the usual reminders: if your mobile phones could be switched off or turned to silent, and to remind you that the council are keeping an attendance list for participants at today's proceedings. Yesterday, we heard evidence from the appellant's landscape witness, and then some discussion on conditions. Again, discussion on conditions was without prejudice. I have this morning received an updated version of those conditions. Can I just confirm that that's an agreed schedule between the council and the appellant?
Yes, madam, thank you.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Now, before we go to closings, I just need to check that all participants have had an opportunity to contribute what they wish to contribute to the proceedings, and whether there are any other participants who wish to speak who haven't yet been heard. I know we've got Anne Phillips again, who's the parish council representative. I understand. Was it your intention that you wish to speak again today, Mrs. Phillips?
Thank you, but I don't need to speak again today.
Okay, thank you very much. In that case, I will turn to the closing speeches, submissions, first of all from Ms. Perec on behalf of the council. Ms. Perec.
Thank you, madam. Can I just check that you've received this in soft copy?
I have, yeah.
Thank you. And Mr. Boyle, I believe someone will be emailing it to you as well, or to your clients anyway. So that should reach you shortly. Madam, this is an appeal relating to an application for outline planning permission with all matters reserved except for 75 dwellings, open space, allotments, landscaping and access via Sheepfair Lane. Sorry for the very early typo. The application was refused by Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council's Development Control Committee for due reasons. The second reason for refusal is no longer an issue between the parties, those matters having been addressed through a Section 106 agreement. It is further noted that the inspector's first main issue is also not an issue, it being accepted that the council does not take an in-principle objection to this appeal site lying outside its settlement policy boundaries. The first reason for refusal, which, madam, is reflected in your second main issue, is concerned with the impact of the proposals on local landscape character, scenic quality and visual quality of the area. Following the completion of evidence, particularly of the two planning witnesses, it appears to be common ground that this appeal will turn on the inspector's assessment of the evidence presented on the second main issue. The council's case, in summary, is that the significant adverse impacts of the scheme on local landscape character, scenic quality and visual quality significantly and demonstrably outweigh its benefits. Madam, you will accordingly be invited to dismiss this appeal. Turning then to the reason for refusal, the outstanding reason for refusal is set out in my closing submissions. You can tend for me not to read it out in full, madam. For ease of reference, it is convenient to split the reason for refusal into two parts: one, landscape impacts, and two, visual impacts. However, for the avoidance of doubt, both parties agree that in terms of landscape impacts, the refusal reason in fact covers three distinct elements, namely the setting of the village of Overton, local landscape character of the area, and scenic quality of the area. Each of these must be considered in reaching an overall view on landscape impacts. Turning them to landscape and visual impacts and starting with landscape impacts. The parties are significantly apart in terms of their case on the landscape impacts of this proposal. Mr. Dudley for the council submits that there will be an overall major to moderate adverse impact in landscape terms, while Mr. Cook for the appellant states that there will be a major net beneficial effect in terms of impacts on the site, with no material impact upon the surrounding landscape character. The council invites the inspector to prefer the evidence of Mr. Dudley and to give little weight, if any, to Mr. Cook's assessment of landscape impacts for three primary reasons. First, Mr. Cook presented an incomplete assessment of the landscape impacts by reference to both the other available evidence and indeed the policy requirements. It was accepted by Mr. Cook in cross-examination that he did not expressly consider a number of landscape elements when reaching his overall conclusion of major net benefit. When pressed in cross-examination, he stated for the first time that he had taken those other elements into account, but he was unable to point a single reference in his proof or his own LBIA to support this claim. The council draws attention to the following omissions. Scale, pattern, openness, enclosure. The proposals were assessed as having a moderate adverse impact on these features by the appellant's original LBIA produced by terra firma. The failure to assess openness, for example, sits at odds with Mr. Cook's own assessment of the site being situated on the northerly facing shallow valley sides and his acceptance in cross-examination that the northerly aspect looks outward to the opposing valley sides. He stated that that was technically correct. History. The proposals were assessed as having a minor adverse impact on this element by the terra firma LBIA. Tranquility. Proposals were assessed as having a moderate minor adverse impact on this element by the terra firma LBIA. This omission is particularly egregious given that the local plan policy EM1 requires specific consideration of the sense of tranquility of an area. The council submits that these are all key elements of the existing landscape, as is evident by their inclusion in the terra firma LBIA and indeed Mr. Dudley's evidence, although we accept that they are dealt with under slightly different headings in Mr. Dudley's proof. It is telling, however, that the elements that were omitted from Mr. Cook's assessment were all, barring one, those which were assessed by the appellant's own prior consultants as producing adverse impacts. Mr. Cook's assessment is therefore clearly incomplete and no weight can be attributed to his overall conclusions in this regard. Second, Mr. Cook presented a disjointed and inconsistent assessment of the landscape elements that he did assess, even by reference to his own methodology. A number of examples became apparent during cross-examination. One, in terms of trees and hedgerows, there was a clear mismatch between what was set out in the LBIA and that in his own proof as regards value and susceptibility. In terms of the public rights of way, his baseline that this scheme would provide many new opportunities to explore new areas on the western side of Overton that were previously not accessible is not borne out on his own evidence of the tolerated trespass across the site. As for water features, Mr. Cook failed to follow his own methodology by ascribing medium value for the absence of any water feature. When pressed, he appeared to be suggesting that it was necessary to give the absence of a feature medium value to get to the degree of effect, which rather begs the question. He was also unable to explain when he would ever deploy a low value, if even the absence of features could merit a medium value in his view. His Appendix 10, Table 1, which summarizes his landscape effects so as to lead to his overall conclusion on major net benefit, is a further example of Mr. Cook's inconsistent approach. For the first time, we see the separating out of trees and hedgerows, which were otherwise considered together in the LBIA and proof, leading to what is clear double counting of his stated benefits. Similarly, pasture is included as an independent benefit, notwithstanding that it is not an existing landscape element and quite properly was not assessed in that sense in his own LBIA or proof. The omissions of other key elements from his assessment that have been set out already further compound the problems with his overall approach. And then turning to the third reason, Madam, Mr. Cook offers an incomplete analysis in terms of the impacts on the wider surrounding landscape. While he sets out and identifies the key characteristics of the relevant national, county and local level character assessments, he fails to properly analyse their implications. Instead, his proof provides exactly the same wording in respect of how the proposals would impact on these character areas. An immediately obvious omission in each of these identical paragraphs is the absence of any reference to the 75 homes that will be built on this site. His analysis, to the extent that there is any, is plainly premised only on the loss of arable fields and the proposed tree planting. As a result, the council submits the appellant has failed to provide a credible or reliable landscape assessment. By contrast, Mr. Dudley for the council provides a balanced and comprehensive assessment, and his conclusions should be preferred. The height of the appellant's criticisms of the council's evidence can be dealt with in brief terms. First, the appellant placed much emphasis on Mr. Dudley's acceptance that the development would not be out of keeping with the existing village, given the adjacent 7 acres development. In cross-examination, Mr. Dudley clarified that he meant that the houses themselves would not be out of character architecturally, which is also plain from the overall context of what he says in his proof. It is in any event a good example of his candid and balanced view as an independent expert. However, the fact that the houses themselves will be in keeping with the settlement, not least because the appellant has also built up the adjacent 7 acres, does not detract from the overall landscape harm as analysed in Mr. Dudley's proof. There are a large number of identified receptors, and this analysis only featured as one part of one such receptor. The appellant alleged that Mr. Dudley had failed to assess the impact on the setting of the village of Overton and therefore had not properly addressed the reason for refusal. As noted above, the impact on the setting of Overton is only one of 3 limbs that go towards the landscape issue. More importantly, however, it is plain on any reading of Mr. Dudley's proof that he has in fact assessed the impact on the setting of the village. In particular, Mr. Cook accepted in cross-examination that the appeal site forms the setting of Overton. Mr. Dudley has plainly assessed the impact of development on this site and therefore on the setting of the village. Mr. Cook further accepted that there was overlap between the setting of the appeal site and the setting of the village. He did not identify which features overlapped, but accepted this was a matter of landscape judgment. When reading the proof as a whole, however, it is clear that the impact on the setting of the village is among the forefront of Mr. Dudley's considerations. See, for example, his chosen receptive strong relationship with settlement edge, his analysis of the role of the site as performing an important buffer between the village and the sunken lanes, and his analysis at paragraph 4.36. That Mr. Dudley either did not take into, moving on to the third criticism, that Mr. Dudley either did not take into account the green infrastructure, or alternatively, that he takes no issue with the proposed green infrastructure. As to that first allegation, this is evidently not the case, as can be seen from Mr. Dudley's baseline. And as to the second allegation, this is also incorrect. As emphasised in cross-examination, Mr. Dudley said that he expressed concerns about public open space expressed concerns about public open space so close to the sunken lanes and the green infrastructure which would screen some views. Further on in cross-examination, Mr. Dudley also stressed how open space would lead to levels of disturbance and that the open farmland was far more effective at preserving tranquility. These concerns are also reflected in his proof. As for Mr. Dudley's landscape evidence itself, the council notes that he undertakes a thorough analysis of the national, county and local level character assessments, as well as an appraisal of the site and its context to identify those characteristics which are likely to be affected by the development. He then provides a full and fair account of the likely impacts, which was summarised in his proof and his evidence in chief as follows. Open arable land use, major, moderate, adverse. Strong relationship with settlement edge, moderate to minor adverse. Network of sunken green lanes on site boundaries, major adverse. Relationship with the northern valley slopes and northwest extents, A, O, and B, major, moderate, adverse. Overall character of site, major, moderate, adverse. And overall character of setting of the site, major, moderate, adverse. Taking these into account, it is Mr. Dudley's clear and convincing evidence that the adverse landscape harm as identified in the reason for refusal is made out. As he has explained, the proposed development represents a large and incongruous extension beyond a long established and logical boundary to the village of Overton, and it will adversely impact on its setting, the local landscape character, and the scenic quality. The complete and permanent loss of the current open and arable fields will have an adverse impact, both in terms of the overall character of the site as well as its setting. The development will have particularly adverse impacts on the network of historic sunken green lanes that run alongside the western and northern boundaries of the site. At present, the site is an important buffer between the village settlement and these sunken lanes. The scheme, if consented, will fundamentally and permanently alter the setting of these historic routes by bringing urban features and built development close to their edge. Turning then to visual impacts. As with landscape impacts, the parties are significantly apart in terms of their case on the visual impacts of this proposal. Mr. Dudley finds significant adverse visual effects, while Mr. Cook finds neutral to beneficial visual impacts arising from the scheme. The Council invites the inspector to give limited weight to Mr. Cook's assessment. While the flaws identified with his analysis and approach remain relevant, the key issue here is that Mr. Cook's case is simply overstated. On his own analysis, he finds either a major or moderate degree of effect on a number of viewpoints. He also finds a number of viewpoints to have a minor degree of effect. However, rather remarkably, he considers that there is not a single visual receptor on which the nature of effect, even where degree of effect is major, is anything short of neutral. This appears to be premised entirely on his view that the scheme will deliver a high standard of design and quality, both matters which are not subject to scrutiny at this stage of outline permission and are therefore at least somewhat speculative. Significantly, there is no acknowledgement whatsoever that building 75 new homes on what is open, undeveloped countryside could have even a minor adverse impact. This rather extreme stance is also out of keeping with the appellant's own previously submitted LBIA from Terra Firma. As a result, and once again, the Council submits the appellant has failed to provide a credible visual assessment. That being said, the Council acknowledges that the inspector will need to make her own judgments while on site visit, and where necessary invites her to consider Mr. Dudley's evidence on this issue. As to Mr. Dudley's evidence itself, the chief criticism levied against him here is that the photographs taken from the western sunken lane were in fact taken from the edge of the sunken lane and not from the perspective of the user who may be walking through the lane. The Council submits that the effect and nature of the views from the sunken lane remain as assessed by Mr. Dudley in his proof, but that the inspector will in any event be able to form her own judgment during her site view. Turning to Mr. Dudley's evidence itself, it is his clear evidence that there will be the following impacts on the listed receptors. Major adverse on residents of Bond Close and Bolton's Close, minor adverse on users of Bond Close, major to moderate adverse on users of Public Bridleway 26, major to moderate adverse on users of Terrell Hill Road, and major to moderate adverse on users of Public Footpath 502. Taking these into account, it is the Council's case that the significant adverse visual impacts identified in the reasons for refusal is made out. This is in respect of sensitive receptors in both the immediate vicinity of the site and also the surrounding countryside. Turning then to an overall assessment on landscape and visual. In summary, the Council submits that the harms identified and the reason for refusal are made out. In this regard, it is important to note that the harm in both landscape and visual terms is in fact found to varying degrees by the Council's landscape officer, the appellant's previous consultants, and Mr. Dudley. It is only Mr. Cook who takes the view that a scheme for 75 homes in open space in the open, undeveloped countryside would lead to net beneficial or neutral impacts in landscape and visual terms. In light of the above assessment, the Council maintains that the significant adverse landscape and visual harm arising from this development would be contrary to local plan policies EM1, EM10, and Overton Neighbourhood Development Plan policies H3, LBE1, and paragraph 174 of the NPPF. That should probably say 174B particularly. I turn then to the planning balance. Section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 sets out a plan-led approach to development, requiring proposals to accord with the adopted development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. It is common ground that paragraph 11D of the NPPF, i.e. the tilted balance, is engaged. On housing land supply, it is common ground between the parties that the Council is not able to demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable housing, giving rise to the tilted balance. The parties disagree as to the extent of the shortfall. The Council contends it has a supply of 4.83 years, and the appellant argues that it can only demonstrate a supply of 4.2 years. This shortfall is considered to be modest by the Council and significant by the appellant. But on either position, it is agreed that significant weight should be given to the delivery of housing from the appeal scheme. Turning then to development plan policies. It is common ground that local plan policies SD1, SS1, including the settlement policy boundaries, SS4, SS5, SS6, and Overton NDP policy H1 continued to attract moderate weight. Local plan policies EM1 and EM10 and Overton NDP policies H3 and LBE1 attract full weight. The conflict with the strategic housing policies must therefore be given moderate weight in the planning balance, while the conflict with the remainder of the policies will naturally attract full weight. Turning then to the benefits. The Council and Appellant agree that significant weight should be given to the provision of housing, that moderate weight should be given to the allotments, and limited weight should be given to energy efficiency and electric charging points. There is some dispute between the parties as to the weight to be attributed to the remainder of the stated benefits. The Council's overarching view is that the benefits attract limited weight insofar as they are mitigation measures required for the development to minimize additional harm and/or simply policy compliant measures. Mr. Miller's evidence was that the provision of affordable housing should be given limited weight as it is merely policy compliant. But he accepted in cross-examination that it was given significant weight in the recent Oakley appeal, and he also accepted the principle of consistency in decision-making applies. The provision of public open space should be given nil weight as it needs to be seen in the context of the loss of undeveloped countryside. But again, this was acknowledged in cross-examination as attracting limited, not nil weight. The biodiversity net gain should be given limited weight as it is merely policy compliant. And the economic benefit should be given moderate weight. But again, here he accepted that this was given significant weight in the recent Oakley appeal and that the principle of consistency in decision-making applies. Ultimately, however, it appears to be common ground that notwithstanding the weight to be attributed to these various benefits, it is the application of the tilted balance and indeed this appeal will turn on whether you, Inspector, accept the Council or the appellant's case on landscape and visual effects. This is because Mr. Miller, in evidence in chief, confirmed that if the Inspector accepted the appellant's evidence on the weight to be attributed to benefits, it would not change his overall conclusion on the tilted balance in light of the degree of landscape and visual harm identified by Mr. Dudley. Similarly, Mrs. Wright in cross-examination accepted that she had only assessed the tilted balance on the basis of either Mr. Cook's evidence or on the basis that the Inspector found only limited landscape and visual harm. It is on either of those scenarios that the tilted balance would not be satisfied. Turning to other material considerations, the appellant has relied on the fact that part of the appeal site was proposed by the Parish Council to be included as reserve site K in the publication version NDP. This was deleted and not included in the adopted NDP. The Council considers that this is a purely neutral factor in the balance because 1, the examination inspector concluded that there was no substantive evidence to demonstrate that the risk assessment table, including site K, would contribute to the achievement of sustainable development. And 2, site K in any event covers only part of the appeal site and was a reserve site to provide either 75 dwellings along with adjacent site J or to accommodate any extra dwellings if the Council increased the number for the NDP. The appeal site was not proposed to be developed in its entirety, even at that stage of the NDP, and this is borne out in the reason for refusal here, which takes issue with the size of this scheme. Turning finally then to my overall assessment, that there is a shortfall in housing in the Council is not in dispute, but the degree of shortfall on either party's account cannot and should not obscure the significant harm that this proposal would cause to the setting of the village of Overton, to the local landscape character, scenic quality and visual quality of the area. Taking into account all of the above, the Council submits that the adverse impacts of the scheme on local landscape character, scenic quality and visual quality significantly and demonstrably outweigh its benefits. The Council therefore invites you, Madam, to dismiss this appeal.
Thank you, Ms. Perec. Mr. Boyle, are you ready to proceed? I have a copy of your submission.
Madam, thank you. Yes, and it should now be available for circulation. Madam, these closing submissions are made on behalf of the appellants, Bargate Homes and Vivid Homes, in respect of an appeal against refusal of outline permission for 75 dwellings, including 40% affordable housing, open space, allotments and landscaping, that is the scheme, on land west of Pond Close, Overton, that is the site. The site, as we know, lies outside but immediately adjacent to the out-of-date settlement boundary of Overton, in a location acknowledged to be sustainable for the purpose of residential development, with access to the requisite services and facilities by non-car mode. The scheme is accessed off Sheepfair Lane through the recently completed Bargate Vivid site 7 acres adjacent, on a site identified by the Neighbourhood Planning Forum, that is the Parish Council, as appropriate for promotion as a neighbourhood plan allocation. This planning appeal is made in the context the Council acknowledges that it cannot demonstrate the required 5-year housing land supply. The application followed supportive pre-application discussions and was recommended for approval by officers, but was refused planning permission by members of committee for 2 reasons. The first relating to landscape and visual impact, and the second to the absence of provision to secure social infrastructure. Reason for refusal 2 solely concerned matters which were recognised to be able to be overcome by a suitable Section 106 obligation and or conditions. The terms of the draft Section 106 obligation and of the conditions have now been agreed. It's common ground that reason for refusal 2 has been overcome and is no longer pursued by way of objection by the local planning authority, as Madam you just heard confirmed by my friend in her closing. Given the agreed position in respect to reason for refusal 2 at the start of the inquiry, you identified 2 main issues for us as follows. Firstly, whether the appeal site is a suitable location for housing, and secondly, the effect of development on the character appearance in the area, including landscape character, scenic quality, and visual quality. I turn first, however, to the question of the development plan and the 5-year housing land supply. The relevant Section 38(6) development plan consists of the Basingstoke and Dean local plan adopted in May 2016 and the Overton neighbourhood plan made in June 2016. Of the former, the most important policies for determining the application, the phrase coming from paragraph 11D of the NPPF, are the suite of strategic spatial policies SS1, SS4, SS5 and SS6, and the landscape policy EM1. Of the latter, the most important policies are H1, H2 and LBE1. SS1 sets minima housing numbers and indicates that the majority will be delivered within settlement boundaries and allocations. SS4 requires the maintenance of 5-year housing land supply. SS5 supports neighbourhood planning and directs an at least number of dwellings to Overton based on the figures in SS1. This is reflected in neighbourhood plan policies H1 and H2. Local plan policy SS6 then restricts development outside settlement boundaries and allocations. It's agreed that SS1, that is housing numbers, is out of date, no longer reflecting an NPPF compliant assessment of development needs. This feeds through to the figures in local plan policies SS4 and SS5 and neighbourhood plan policies H1 and H2. They and the settlement boundaries relied upon in SS1 and SS6 are consequently out of date. In addition, as Mrs. Wright pointed out, the appeal proposals, whilst being in conflict with SS6 and partial conflict with SS1, actually foster the achievement of SS4 and are not in conflict with SS5, which is also expressed as minimum. Equally, while the schemes are not supported by neighbourhood plan policies H1 and H2, there is no conflict with those, as they are framed positively and do not themselves seek to restrict development. Further, given that the SS1 figures on which the spatial strategy is founded are out of date, and given the acknowledged inability of the Council to demonstrate the required 5-year housing land supply, it's agreed that paragraph 11D(2) of the NPPF is engaged, and these policies, SS1, 4, 5, 6, H1 and H2, are to be accorded reduced weight. The parties are agreed that only moderate weight is to be accorded to any breach of them. This moderate weight is common ground regardless of whether the 5-year housing land supply is 4.83 years as contended for by the Council or 4.2 as contended for by the appellant, or anywhere in between. Moreover, and in any event, the Council does not cite policies SS1, 4, 5 and 6, H1 or H2 as justifying the withholding of permission. Reason for refusal 1 is the only operative objection to the grant of planning permission for these much needed houses. It alleges a landscape and visual objection and aligns therefore, Madam, with your second main issue. Importantly, as recognised by the Council, reason for refusal 2 does not seek to resist the scheme on the basis of the principle of being outside the settlement boundary and in the designated countryside. Lastly, it's agreed that the consequence of the operation of paragraph 11d(2) is that this appeal falls to be determined under section 38(6) through the prism of the presumption in favour of sustainable development as expressed in the so-called tilted balance. Consistent with national policy, permission should only be refused if the harms identified, here limited to landscape and visual impact on a non-valued landscape adjacent to the urban edge, significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme. Madam, I turn then to your main issue 1, suitability of the site for housing. As a result of the above, it was agreed by Mr. Miller for the Council that your main issue 1 is not in dispute between the parties, and you may proceed on the basis that, setting to one side main issue 2 in reason refusal 1, it is common ground that this is a suitable location for housing development. And again, you've had that confirmed by Madam Friend in her closing. As noted in opening, this is unsurprising, though welcome concession on behalf of the local planning authority. First, as observed above, the adopted settlement boundaries relied upon in SS1 and SS6 in and of themselves are agreed to be out of date, being predicated on non-NPPF assessments of development needs now outdated. Secondly, the Council's acknowledged inability to be able to demonstrate the required five-year housing land supply is agreed to engage paragraph 11d(2) of the NPPF, such that the most important policies are deemed out of date and reduced weight may be accorded to them. These include strategic policies SS1, 4, 5 and 6, none of which, as noted above, is cited in the reason for refusal. Thus, as acknowledged in the Council's opening and its planning evidence, there is no in-principle spatial objection to development on this site. Although, again, as noted above, there is disagreement as to the precise extent of the Council's failure, 4.83 years against 4.2 years, there is agreement that the consequence of the failure is that only moderate negative weight may be given to the spatial policies breached, while significant positive weight must be given to the delivery of housing and of affordable housing through the scheme. In this regard, as I noted in opening, it's noteworthy that the appellants are jointly Vivid Homes and Bargate Homes, a company owned by Vivid. As one of the largest affordable housing providers in the south of England, Vivid has no need to bank funding, will be able to proceed to build out as soon as conditions are discharged. Not only would Vivid deliver the acute need of 40% affordable housing, Bargate's commercial profits are reinvested by Vivid in their wider affordable housing programme. Thirdly, the site is acknowledged to be an accessible location for access to services and facilities, well connected to the settlement of Overton, which itself is identified as a sustainable settlement for additional housing growth, and adjacent to the recent greenfield extension to that settlement, also by Bargate and Vivid, which sets the tone for the scheme now at appeal. Fourthly, the planning history of the site reveals that while it is currently unallocated, this should not to be seen as adverse to its credentials as a suitable site for allocation. The Council's landscape capacity study, the Council's Sheila, and the work undertaken by the Parish Councillors Neighbourhood Planning Forum all identified it as a site suitable to be allocated through the neighbourhood plan process. As a result, it was included within the draft neighbourhood plan that went to examination. This necessarily included its performance in terms of landscape and visual impact. Its eventual deletion by the examiner was not as a result of finding against it on its planning merits as a suitable location for housing. Fifthly, the scheme now at appeal was carefully formulated with planning officers at the local planning authority, notwithstanding the non-allocation in the neighbourhood plan. The configuration of development parcels and the devotion of significant part of the site to open space and green infrastructure takes advantage of the topography of the site and its relationship to the existing urban area, to create a scheme which fits with the grain of the locale while limiting wider land impact on the receiving landscape, a landscape which is acknowledged not to be a quote valued landscape for the purpose of paragraph 174A of the NPPF. All of the above indicates the Council was right to accept that there's no in-principle objection to the development of this site. Indeed, the professional analysis of it, both by or behalf of the Council, of the site, both by or on behalf of the Council and the Parish Council, has consistently been this is an appropriate site for development as and when housing numbers are needed. On the ongoing absence of five-year land supply since 2019 and projected now well into the future, as well as the continuing affordable housing crisis, it is demonstrable that additional housing is indeed needed. Mr. Miller was right, therefore, to concede that, Madam, that you may proceed on the basis that the first main issue is not an issue between the parties. Indeed, it is resolved in favour of the grant of permission. Main issue 2 then, effect on local landscape character and visual quality. The above matters set an important context to the remaining main issue, that is number 2, and the only operative reason for refusal, that is number 1. It's worth noting in the context above and in the acknowledged absence of demonstrable 5-year housing land supply, that any harm to this non-valued landscape would need to be significantly and demonstrably more weighty than the sum of the significant planning benefits which it is common ground arise from the provision of housing and affordable housing, the economic contributions, the ecological and the landscape improvements that form part of this entire scheme. It is, we respectfully submit, not credible to claim such. First, the site itself is an unremarkable plot of 2 arable fields with no notable landscape features within the site and bounded along the whole of its eastern length by the existing settlement of Overton. The settlement edge, particularly by Pond Close, is unappealing, and as recognised Mr Dudley, the proposal has the potential to improve this. Secondly, the site sits within a landscape which is accepted not to fall within the terms of valued landscape within the meaning of paragraph 174A of the NPPF, and thus finds itself off the bottom of the hierarchy identified in paragraph 175. This does not mean that there is no value in the receiving landscape, and any harm to its intrinsic beauty must be taken into account. But equally, it is a location more readily suitable for development, as recognised by the Council's capacity study, which scored it a medium-high capacity. Thirdly, the site is extremely well contained, bounded by settlement to the east, mature lines of vegetation to the north and west, and the topography of the plateau to the south, such that public views of it are limited, localised, and where available, filtered. This is borne out by Mr Dudley's viewpoint planned at his Appendix 3, where all the views are on the immediate boundary of the site, or no more than 1 field away. Fourthly, although the AONB is visible from the site, on the other side of the test valley, it is at a distance from the site such that no material impact is discerned from the AONB. Although there was perhaps an attempt in Mr Dudley's evidence to bring AONB into play by way of elevating sensitivity to some of his landscape receptors, he accepted that the Council did not allege impact on the AONB, a matter confirmed by Mr Miller, who additionally acknowledged that AONB policies were not said to be breached, nor was paragraph 11d(1) or footnote 7 said to be engaged. Fifthly, within the site, some 6.25 hectares is given over to green infrastructure. Only 3.14 hectares is proposed for built development, and this built development is proposed, illustratively, to follow the pattern of that adjacent at 7 acres, a scheme which the local planning authority approved and which both Mr Dudley and Mr Cook consider to be of high quality. In addition, the location of the 3.14 hectares development parcels follows the grain of the landform, echoing the identification of Site K in the Sheila, such the southern parcel aligns itself with 7 acres and the northern parcel tucks itself into the hollow adjacent to Pond Close. Of the remaining 6.25 hectares devoted to green infrastructure, the illustrative scheme shows additional hedge and tree planting, a woodland shore on the southern boundary, a community orchard, allotments, and an extensive area of wildflower meadow, a landscape feature whose expansion is encouraged in this landscape character area. Thus, while the site is contained, the proposed development site area will exert an even more reduced influence on the wider landscape. The undeveloped area will enhance the local landscape resource, and the built form is acknowledged to be in keeping with the adjacent settlement, following the good design approach of 7 acres and representing an improvement on Pond Close. This is a scheme which, far from causing harm to the landscape and visual resource of the borough, will bring tangible landscape and visual benefits. Inevitably, immediately adjacent to the site, there will be a change experienced to landscape character and to views. But it's noteworthy that the sunken lanes to the north and west are heavily contained within their embowering vegetation, while the Pond Close views are in the context of the existing 1960s, 1970s suburban style estate. The proposals, as correctly analysed by Mr Cook, taken together, will actually amount to a net improvement in landscape character and visual quality over the 2 featureless arable fields currently present. Taken either way, that is, limited and localised harm to a non-para 174A landscape, or actually a landscape and visual benefit overall, main issue 2 does not, respectfully submitted, amount to a justification for withholding permission. The manifest planning merits of the scheme favour its approval in the public interest on the straight balance, but even more emphatically on the tilted balance in paragraph 11d(2), which is acknowledged to be the policy test by which the appeal forced to be judged. I then turned to those benefits and the planning balance. Madam, you'll recall that Mrs. Wright set out her assessment of benefits and their weight at section 8 of her proof, and that evidence is respectfully commended to you. Significant weight is agreed to be accorded to the provision of market housing. This is regardless of the land supply position, although the absence of a 5-year land supply emphasises the importance of additional delivery of supply. Mr. Miller accepted that he had no reason to depart from the brief's conclusions by inspectors and his own instructing counsel that a significant weight should also be given to the provision of affordable housing at policy compliant levels. It was agreed the same applied to significant weight to be given to the economic contribution of building 75 dwellings. Public open spaces to increase from 0 on site to 6.25 hectares in the context of the policy requirement is half a hectare, and the trespass desire lines plainly indicate an existing public pressure and or demand for use of the site for recreational access to the countryside. The ecological enhancement of the wildflower grassland, the woodland, tree, hedge and orchard planting all create a biodiversity net gain of some 27%, far in excess of the government's current suggestion of 10% in its draft legislation, again as accepted by Mr. Miller. Healthy places and low carbon economy are fostered by the growing spaces and climate change initiatives. This basket of benefits then needs to be gathered together and weighed on the positive side of the tilted balance. It is only if the sum of these various and significant benefits is itself significantly outweighed that permission should be denied. It's Mrs. Wright's clear evidence and my respectful submission that even put at its highest, the Council's identification of localised landscape and visual harm to a non-para 174A landscape immediately adjacent to the settlement edge of Overton could not possibly be said to carry significantly greater than the sum of the significant greater weight than the sum of the significant benefits outlined above. On Mr. Cook's correct analysis, there would actually be a landscape and visual benefit also to place in the positive scale. Either way, paragraph 11d(2) of the MPPF would indicate that permission should be granted. And accordingly, Madam, now the evidence has been explored through the inquiry, we do respectfully invite you to allow the appeal and approve this much needed housing and associated landscape and ecological improvements in the public interest.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. At this point, I think it's just sensible for me to outline, because I know there are a number of participants and attendees that both sides have set out a number of points that I need to consider in landscape terms and the places from which I need to look at those. So that will be an important part of my consideration. So that will take place the week after next in my visit, and then my deliberations will follow that. So now that all the evidence has been heard and the discussion on conditions and planning obligations has already taken place, that leaves me just to confirm the position in relation to costs. It was indicated yesterday by both parties that they wouldn't be submitting any cost applications. I just need to clarify that with you, that remains the case as of this morning.
It does. Thank you, Madam. Yes.
Thank you. In that case, all that's left for me to do is to thank all participants for their contributions.
Forgive me, Madam, to interrupt us. The timing of the submission of the 106, I think, is just left hanging. We respectfully requested a fortnight, which I think actually rather nicely coincides with your site visit. So if we could get it formally confirmed, obviously if we have it available to come earlier, it will come earlier. But if it could be submitted by whatever that Friday is, it would be the, I think, 15th, is it?
Let me just double check that date. Bear with me 1 second. Yes, the 15th. So that would be 2 weeks today, which would coincide with your previous request. Forgive me for not having confirmed that beforehand. I think it's just important that I think there've been a number of queries raised in terms of the communications from the office, and I'm just going to double check that again, see whether anything else has come in that I need to address. Just bear with me one moment. Yeah, I think I've had one communication which relates to the some representations from Mrs. Brady on I think just reiterating some points of concern about the timing of any construction hours in conditions, which I'll have a look at, and I'll ask Mrs. Humphrey to send that on to both parties for information. I think that was all that I've got. Just to reassure attendees and people who are listening to the live feed that obviously I need to consider all of the information before me, both written and that's given to me already this week, and I'd go away and think about that in the light of the work I need to do on landscape impact before coming to a judgment. So that's just to reassure people who are listening. Anything else before I formally close? Ms. Pratt? No. Okay. So if I can just thank all participants for their contributions, and that's not just during the inquiry this week, but their written contributions as well. I'm grateful for the cooperation shown and the assistance that you've given me in seeking to understand those issues. So the time is now 11:17, and I formally close the inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you.